"I'm sorry, ma'am, but the bride specifically requested that you not enter the venue," the young woman at the reception table whispered as guests in black tuxedos and silk dresses slowly turned to stare at me beneath the glowing rooftop lights of Manhattan. I stood there for a moment holding the small silver gift box I had wrapped myself the night before, my fingers tightening around the ribbon while the sound of violins drifted through the open glass doors behind her. My son Ryan was getting married less than 50 feet away from me, and somehow I was no longer welcome at his wedding. I'm Evelyn Carter, 67 years old, born and raised in New York, and until that evening, I still believed there were some humiliations a mother would never have to experience from her own child. Follow my story until the end because what happened that night changed the Carter family forever. The September air carried that early autumn chill Manhattan gets just after sunset, cool enough to make the city feel elegant instead of crowded. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready inside my apartment on the Upper West Side. Not because anyone would notice. At my age, people rarely do. But because Ryan used to notice. When he was little, he would smile every time I wore blue and tell me I looked like Grace Kelly. So I wore blue that night. A soft navy dress with pearl earrings my late husband had given me on our 30th anniversary. I even curled my silver hair carefully despite my arthritis making my hands ache halfway through. I kept telling myself this day mattered. That families healed eventually. That whatever distance had grown between Ryan and me these past few years could still be repaired. The wedding invitation never arrived, but I convinced myself it had been lost in the mail. Sophie handled everything now. The guest lists. The holiday plans, the reservations, even Ryan's schedule. And every time I asked gentle questions, Ryan always sounded distracted. "Mom, Sophie's just stressed with the wedding," he would say. "Don't make things harder right now." So when my neighbor Arlene casually asked me 3 days earlier what I planned to wear to Ryan's wedding, I smiled and pretended I had known the details all along. That was how I learned the ceremony was happening at the Grand Crescent Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Not from my son. Not from family. From a neighbor who assumed any mother would obviously be invited to her own son's wedding. I should have understood then. I should have stayed home with my dignity intact. But motherhood does strange things to women. Even after betrayal, some small part of you still hopes your child will look up, see your face in the crowd, and remember who loved him first. The elevator ride to the rooftop ballroom had felt endless. I remember watching the floor numbers light up one by one while my heartbeat grew heavier inside my chest. 22nd floor. 23rd. 24th. By the time the doors opened, the sound of champagne glasses and soft laughter spilled into the hallway. White roses lined the entrance. Crystal candles flickered against mirrored walls. Beyond the glass windows, the New York skyline shimmered like something from an old movie. It was beautiful. Painfully beautiful. Then the receptionist asked for my name. The moment she typed Evelyn Carter into her tablet, her expression changed. Not rude. Not cruel. Just uncomfortable in the way people look when they've been forced into someone else's family tragedy. "One moment, please," she said quietly before disappearing behind a curtain. When she returned, she avoided my eyes completely. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she whispered. "The bride left instructions that you were not permitted inside tonight." Around me, conversations softened. A man near the champagne tower glanced over his shoulder. 2 bridesmaids stopped talking entirely. I felt every eye in the room slide toward me while the violin music continued playing as if nothing had happened at all. Then through the ballroom doors I finally saw Ryan. My son stood near the altar in a black tuxedo, smiling at someone beside him. For one fragile second, relief flooded through me. Surely this was all a misunderstanding. Surely once Ryan saw me standing there alone, embarrassed in front of strangers, he would come over immediately. He looked directly at me. Our eyes met across the ballroom, and then my son slowly turned away. I do not remember how long I stood there after Ryan looked away from me. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe a full minute. Time feels strange when humiliation arrives quietly instead of loudly. Nobody screamed at me. Nobody caused a scene. The violin quartet kept playing near the rooftop garden, while waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne glasses and tiny crab cakes through the crowd as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the worst part. The normalcy of it all. My exclusion had already been organized, rehearsed, and accepted long before I ever stepped into that ballroom. The young receptionist shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Would you like me to call a car for you, ma'am?" she asked softly. I looked down at the silver gift box still resting in my hands. Inside was Ryan's grandfather's watch, a vintage Omega his father had worn for nearly 20 years before cancer took him. The leather strap was worn smooth with age. Ryan used to beg to wear it when he was little, letting the oversized face slide around his tiny wrist while pretending he was grown up. 3 months earlier, he told me during a phone call that he hoped someday he would have something meaningful to pass down to his own son. I spent $200 restoring that watch for his wedding day. $200 I probably should not have spent. My retirement checks were modest now, and Manhattan was not kind to elderly women living alone. Still, I wanted my son to have one piece of his father beside him at the altar. Instead, I stood there holding it like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong event.
"No," iyan suarat quietly.
"I can manage." I turned carefully before anyone could see my face too clearly. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I walked back toward the elevators. Behind me, laughter erupted near the ballroom entrance. Somebody must have made a toast. I pressed the elevator button once and waited in silence beneath the golden lights while the city glittered outside the rooftop windows. A younger woman stepped beside me holding a cream-colored clutch purse. She looked at me for a moment before lowering her voice. "I think what they did to you was wrong," she whispered gently. I gave her a polite smile, though it barely reached my eyes. "Thank you," I said. The elevator doors opened before either of us could say anything else. During the ride down 24 floors, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls. The navy dress suddenly looked foolish. My pearl earrings too formal. My silver curls too carefully arranged for a celebration I had never truly been invited to attend. I thought about my late husband Thomas then. Thomas Carter would have never allowed this to happen. Even at his sickest, even during those final months when walking across our apartment exhausted him, he still protected me in small ways. If a restaurant waiter ignored me, Thomas noticed. If someone interrupted me during conversation, Thomas redirected attention back to me. "Evelyn deserves respect," he used to say calmly whenever people overlooked me. But Thomas had been gone for 6 years now, and grief changes the structure of a family in ways nobody warns you about. Some people grow closer after loss. Others quietly rearrange themselves around the empty space left behind. Ryan changed after Sophie entered his life. First it happened slowly. Sunday dinners became monthly dinners. Then holidays became negotiations. Thanksgiving with Sophie's family one year. Christmas brunch instead of dinner the next. Every adjustment seemed harmless on its own. Temporary. Reasonable. I kept telling myself relationships evolved as children grew older. But standing inside that elevator, I finally allowed myself to see the truth clearly. Sophie had not removed me from one wedding. She had spent years removing me from Ryan's life piece by piece so gradually that neither of us noticed until almost nothing remained. Outside the hotel, Manhattan buzzed with its usual Saturday night energy. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic beneath glowing billboards, while couples hurried along the sidewalks wrapped in coats against the cool September air. Somewhere above me on the 24th floor, my son was probably exchanging vows while photographers captured smiling family portraits that no longer included his mother. My phone vibrated suddenly inside my purse. For one foolish second, hope rushed through me so quickly it hurt. Maybe Ryan had finally realized what happened. Maybe he was calling to fix this terrible misunderstanding before it became permanent. But when I looked down at the screen, the name waiting there was not Ryan. It was Howard Green, my late husband's attorney. Howard Green had been my husband's attorney for more than 30 years. But before that, he had been Thomas's college roommate. The two of them used to disappear together every Sunday morning to play golf somewhere outside the city, always returning sunburned and laughing about stories I had heard at least 100 times before. After Thomas died, Howard still called occasionally to check on me, though our conversations had grown less frequent these past few years. I answered the phone while standing beneath the glowing hotel awning as taxis splashed through wet pavement nearby. "Howard," I said quietly, "this is unexpected." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "Evelyn," he replied carefully, "I was hoping I could still catch you before the ceremony ended." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. Not panic exactly, Just the heavy feeling that arrives when life prepares to shift once again. Howard Green had been my husband's attorney for almost 30 years. His voice was always calm, measured, the kind of voice that made people trust him even before he finished a sentence. But that night, standing beneath the glowing hotel entrance while wedding guests laughed somewhere high above me, I heard something unusual in his tone. Concern. "Evelyn," he said carefully after I answered, "are you alone?" I glanced back at the revolving doors of the hotel where another group of guests stepped inside carrying wrapped gifts and champagne-colored envelopes. "Yes," I replied quietly. "I just left the wedding." There was a brief silence on the line. Not awkward. Heavy. Like a man deciding how much truth another person could survive in one evening. "I was afraid of that," Howard finally said. A taxi splashed through a puddle nearby as cold wind swept down the Manhattan street, lifting the hem of my navy coat. "Afraid of what?" I asked. Howard exhaled slowly. "Your husband asked me to contact you if certain things ever began happening inside the family." I frowned slightly. "Thomas said that?" "Several years ago," Howard answered. "After Ryan started dating Sophie." My fingers tightened around my purse strap. Cars crawled past beneath glowing traffic lights while somewhere above me my son was probably dancing his first dance with the woman who had just banned me from attending his wedding. "I do not understand," I whispered. Howard lowered his voice further. "Thomas loved Ryan deeply, but he worried Ryan was becoming too dependent on Sophie's influence. Financially, emotionally, socially." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Thomas had always been protective, especially after his cancer diagnosis. Toward the end, he questioned everyone around him. Nurses, doctors, even neighbors offering help. But as I stood there listening to Howard speak, small forgotten memories began surfacing quietly inside my mind. Thomas asking why Ryan suddenly stopped visiting alone. Thomas noticing Sophie answered questions directed at Ryan before he could speak for himself. Thomas watching silently during Christmas dinner while Sophie rearranged seating so I ended up alone at the far corner of the table. At the time, I told myself he was simply exhausted from treatment. But maybe he had seen something I refused to see. "There is another reason I called tonight," Howard continued. "I received paperwork this afternoon involving the Carter family trust." My stomach tightened immediately. "What paperwork?" Another pause. "Authorization requests connected to Ryan's inheritance portfolio." I leaned against the cold stone wall outside the hotel entrance. Thomas had built that trust slowly over decades through real estate investments and construction contracts across New York and Connecticut. It was never extravagant wealth, but it was enough to protect future generations of the Carter family. Enough that Thomas treated it very seriously. "Ryan has access to the trust after the wedding," Howard explained carefully. "But certain clauses become active only after legal review." "What kind of clauses?" I asked. "Protective ones." The city noise suddenly felt distant around me. "Howard," I said slowly, "what are you trying to tell me?" His voice softened. "I think Sophie expected those protections to disappear tonight." I closed my eyes briefly as cold air filled my lungs. "You believe this wedding is about money?" "I believe," Howard answered carefully, "that your husband feared someone might eventually isolate Ryan from his family in order to gain influence over those assets." Across the street, a young couple laughed while sharing an umbrella beneath the glowing lights of a corner restaurant. Normal people. Ordinary lives. Meanwhile, my own family felt like it was quietly collapsing behind expensive ballroom doors 24 floors above me. "Thomas left additional instructions for me," Howard said. "Instructions I was only supposed to act on if you were publicly humiliated or deliberately excluded by immediate family." My heartbeat slowed strangely then, not from calmness but from realization. Thomas had anticipated this. Somehow years ago my husband had already seen the shape of the loneliness waiting for me. "What instructions?" I whispered. Howard's voice became firm again. "Do not go home yet, Evelyn. I need to show you something first." Howard asked me to meet him at his office near Bryant Park. At nearly 9:30 at night, most of the surrounding buildings were already dark except for scattered office windows glowing against the Manhattan skyline. I almost told him no. I was exhausted, humiliated, and suddenly aware that my feet hurt terribly inside the navy heels I had chosen so carefully for my son's wedding. But something in Howard's voice reminded me of Thomas during the final weeks before he died. Calm on the surface.
Urgent indernite.
So 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting across from Howard inside a quiet conference room overlooking 6th Avenue while taxis moved below like streaks of yellow light. Howard loosened his tie slightly before placing a thick cream-colored folder on the polished mahogany table between us. My husband always loved mahogany. Dining tables, bookshelves, desks, he used to say real would age it with dignity instead of trying to hide its years. Funny how furniture sometimes receives more respect than elderly women do. Thomas updated the family trust 18 months before he passed, Howard explained carefully. Most of the changes involved Ryan. I stared at the folder without touching it. Why would Thomas keep this from me? Howard folded his hands slowly. Because he hoped he was wrong. Outside the conference room windows, rain had started falling lightly over Manhattan. Thin silver lines against the dark glass. Your husband noticed unusual financial requests from Sophie shortly after her engagement to Ryan, Howard continued. Nothing illegal, but persistent. My stomach tightened again. What kind of requests? Questions about inheritance structures, property transfers, ownership timelines. I looked away toward the city lights. Sophie always spoke sweetly around me. Polite, controlled. But now that I thought about it, she asked strange questions sometimes during family dinners. Casual questions disguised as curiosity. Who inherits the Connecticut townhouse someday? Did Thomas ever update his estate plan? Ryan should really learn more about the family investments. At the time, I convinced myself she simply wanted to feel included in the family. But sitting inside that office, the memories felt different somehow. Sharper. Like old photographs finally coming into focus. Howard opened the folder carefully and slid several printed documents across the table. Bank statements. Property evaluations. Legal correspondence. 3 months ago, he said quietly, Sophie attempted to access information connected to the Carter Trust through Ryan. I frowned. Attempted. Howard nodded once. The trust contains protective clauses. Certain assets cannot transfer if there is evidence of coercion, isolation from immediate family, or manipulation involving elder relatives. I stared at him in disbelief. Thomas added all of that? Personally, Howard replied. He was very specific. My chest tightened unexpectedly then. Not from sadness exactly. Something deeper. The strange ache of realizing someone had protected you even after they were gone. I thought about Thomas sitting in hospital rooms pretending not to notice my fear, while secretly rewriting legal documents to shield me from humiliation years later. There is more, Howard said gently. He reached into the folder again and removed several printed emails. These were recovered during a compliance review yesterday afternoon. My fingers hesitated before taking them. The first email was from Sophie to a luxury real estate broker in Connecticut. The date was only 6 weeks old. I read the sentence twice before fully understanding it. Once Ryan receives access after the wedding, we plan to liquidate the older property quickly. Older property. The Connecticut townhouse Thomas bought during our first years of marriage. The house where Ryan learned to ride a bicycle. Where Thomas planted roses along the front fence every spring because he knew I loved them. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page. Another message. Another sentence that felt colder than the rain outside. His mother will probably resist emotionally, but Ryan knows boundaries are necessary. I lowered the paper slowly. The room became very quiet. Howard watched me carefully but said nothing. He did not need to. Everything was already there in black ink across expensive stationery. Not grief. Not misunderstanding. Planning. Deliberate planning. Sophie was not simply trying to keep me away from one wedding. She was trying to erase me from the future of the Carter family completely. I sat there silently for a long moment before finally asking the question that frightened me most. Does Ryan know about these emails? Howard's expression darkened slightly. I honestly do not know anymore, Evelyn. I left Howard's office just after midnight. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk still shimmered beneath the city lights while steam rose from subway grates into the cold Manhattan air. I should have felt devastated after everything I had learned that night. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Not happy. Not numb. Just clear for the first time in years. There is a moment in every betrayal when confusion finally dies. When excuses stop sounding reasonable. When all the scattered pieces suddenly lock together into one ugly picture. Standing there beneath the glowing streetlights, I realized Sophie had never wanted a family. She wanted access. Access to Ryan's future. Access to Carter properties. Access to the quiet security Thomas spent 40 years building brick by brick. And somewhere along the way, my son either failed to notice or chose not to notice. I walked 3 blocks before realizing I was still carrying the small silver gift box with Ryan's watch inside. The ribbon had loosened slightly from how tightly I had been holding it all evening. I almost laughed at the irony. I had spent weeks preparing a sentimental wedding gift while my future daughter-in-law quietly planned how to remove me from the family entirely. A black sedan slowed beside the curb near Bryant Park. The rear window rolled down slowly. "Grandma?" A familiar voice called softly. I blinked in surprise. Olivia Carter leaned toward the open window wearing a pale gold bridesmaid dress beneath a wool coat that looked hastily thrown over her shoulders. Ryan's daughter from his first marriage had Thomas's eyes. Calm blue. Observant. Too observant sometimes. "Olivia." I stepped closer. "What are you doing here?" She glanced around nervously before opening the passenger door. "Please get in before somebody sees me." Inside the car, the heater hummed softly while jazz music played low through the speakers. Olivia looked exhausted. Her mascara slightly smudged. Her hands twisting together in her lap. "I saw what happened upstairs," she whispered. "I tried to stop them." I looked at her quietly without speaking. Olivia had always been careful around Sophie. Polite but distant in the way children become when they sense tension adults refuse to acknowledge aloud. "Your father saw me?" I finally asked. Olivia nodded once. "He froze when he saw you at the entrance." A bitter ache moved quietly through my chest. "But he still let me leave." Olivia lowered her eyes. "Sophie told security you were trying to sabotage the wedding." I stared at her in disbelief. "What?" "She told people you had become unstable since Grandpa died." Olivia continued softly. "That you were obsessed with controlling Dad's life." For several seconds I could not speak at all. Outside the car window, couples hurried through the wet streets carrying shopping bags and umbrellas, while somewhere downtown my son's wedding reception continued beneath chandeliers and champagne toasts. And inside that ballroom, people probably believed I was some bitter elderly woman trying to ruin her son's happiness. Sophie had not just excluded me. She had rewritten me. Olivia reached into her purse carefully before pulling out a small flash drive. "I was not supposed to hear this," she whispered. "But 2 nights ago, I went upstairs at the hotel to bring Sophie her phone charger." She swallowed hard. The bridal suite door was partly open. I stared at the flash drive resting in her trembling hand. "What is on this?" Olivia hesitated. "Video." A cold heaviness settled inside the car. "Video of what?" Her eyes filled slightly then. "Sophie talking to her bridesmaids." She lowered her voice even more. "Grandma. She laughed about you." I looked down at the tiny silver drive resting in her palm, while the soft jazz music continued playing through the speakers. Such a small object. Barely larger than a house key. Strange how entire families can collapse because of things small enough to fit inside your hand. Olivia slowly placed the flash drive into my palm. "I think Grandpa knew exactly who she was," she whispered. I did not watch the video immediately. Some truths require preparation before you survive them. Olivia drove me back to my apartment on the Upper West Side just after 1 in the morning. The streets were quieter then, washed silver beneath the glow of traffic lights and storefront reflections. New York always feels strangely lonely after midnight, as if the city finally exhales once everyone finishes pretending to be important. Olivia carried my overnight bag upstairs even though I insisted I could manage myself. Inside the apartment, the silence wrapped around me instantly. My pearl earrings rested cold against my skin. The navy dress suddenly felt too tight across my chest. I moved slowly through the familiar rooms, turning on small lamps one by one instead of the overhead lights. Thomas used to say soft lighting made a home feel forgiving. I wondered what he would think if he saw our family now. Olivia stood awkwardly near the kitchen counter while I filled the kettle with water. You should not have had to see any of this tonight, I told her quietly. She looked down at the hardwood floor. I already saw most of it a long time ago. That answer stayed with me. I placed 2 teacups on the counter automatically, the same floral set Thomas and I bought during a weekend trip to Vermont nearly 20 years earlier. Marriage leaves little ghosts inside ordinary objects. Teacups, jackets, half-read books. Even after death, the routines remain waiting for someone who never comes home. Olivia accepted the tea with trembling hands. She was only 24, but exhaustion had already settled around her eyes in the way it does for children forced to grow up around emotional tension. Dad changed after Sophie, she whispered after a long silence. I stirred my tea slowly without looking up. I know. No, Olivia said quietly. I do not think you do. The room became still again. Outside the apartment windows, rainwater dripped softly from fire escapes onto the empty street below. The first year was not bad, Olivia continued carefully. But then Sophie started controlling everything. Holiday dinners, guest lists, family trips. Who got invited to what? She swallowed hard. And every time Dad disagreed with her, she cried. I closed my eyes briefly. Sophie cried beautifully. Even I remembered that. Soft tears. Quiet voice. The kind of sadness that makes other people immediately feel guilty. Dad always apologized afterward, Olivia whispered. Usually to her. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while steam curled upward from my untouched tea. Why did nobody tell me? Olivia looked genuinely heartbroken then. Because you always defended him. That hurt more than I expected. She was right. Every missed holiday. Every canceled dinner. Every strange excuse. I always protected Ryan from blame inside my own mind. Mothers become translators for their sons sometimes. We turn silence into stress. Cruelty into confusion. Absence into exhaustion. Anything except the truth. Olivia finally reached into her purse again and removed an old photograph. I found this last month inside Grandpa's desk drawer, she said softly. It was a picture from Ryan's first wedding nearly 15 years earlier. Thomas stood beside me smiling proudly, while Ryan held Olivia in his arms as a toddler. Back then his eyes still looked open somehow. Warm. Present. Human. Grandpa wrote something on the back, Olivia whispered. I turned the photograph over slowly. In Thomas's familiar handwriting were 7 words. Protect Evelyn when I no longer can. My throat tightened so suddenly I could not speak. Thomas knew. Not every detail. Not the future exactly. But he understood something dangerous was happening around this family long before I did. Olivia stood quietly and walked toward the living room window. There is more on the flash drive than just Sophie talking, she said carefully without facing me. What do you mean? She hesitated. Dad was there too. The apartment suddenly felt colder. Ryan appears in the video? Olivia nodded slowly. Not at first. But near the end. I stared at the small silver flash drive resting beside my untouched teacup. Such a tiny thing. Yet somehow it now carried the weight of my entire family inside it. Olivia finally turned toward me. Her voice barely above a whisper. Grandma. I do not think Dad realized someone was recording. I waited until nearly 3 in the morning before opening the video file. Olivia had fallen asleep on my living room sofa beneath the knitted blanket Thomas used every winter while reading newspapers by the window. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and distant sirens somewhere downtown. I sat alone at the kitchen table with my reading glasses low on my nose, and the silver flash drive plugged into my old laptop. For a moment I almost closed it without watching. Some illusions survive only because we refuse to look directly at them. But then I remembered Ryan turning away from me at the ballroom entrance. Not confused. Not surprised. Deliberate. So I pressed play. The video opened inside a luxury hotel suite glowing with soft golden lights. Champagne bottles rested in silver buckets beside makeup cases and garment bags while bridesmaids moved through the room laughing in satin robes. Sophie stood near the large windows overlooking Manhattan wearing a white silk dressing gown with her hair pinned halfway up for styling. She looked beautiful in the careful, polished way magazine women always do. Controlled. Expensive. Empty. Tomorrow changes everything. One bridesmaid laughed while raising a champagne glass. Sophie smiled slowly before answering. Tomorrow finally makes everything official. They all laughed softly. At first, the conversation sounded harmless. Wedding nerves. Honeymoon plans. Discussions about flowers and seating charts. Then one woman asked casually, "So what are you doing about Ryan's mother?" Sophie rolled her eyes immediately. "Please do not ruin my mood tonight." More laughter followed. I felt my stomach tighten quietly as Sophie walked toward the minibar, pouring herself another glass of champagne. "Honestly," she said, "Evelyn still thinks she is the center of this family." One bridesmaid frowned slightly. "Is she coming tomorrow?" Sophie laughed again, colder this time. "Absolutely not." The room erupted with nervous amusement. "Ryan agreed?" Another voice asked carefully. Sophie took a slow sip of champagne before answering. "Ryan agrees with whatever keeps the peace." Something inside my chest shifted painfully then. Not because of Sophie. I already understood her. It was hearing my son reduced so casually. Weak. Managed. Predictable. Sophie moved closer toward the camera then, unaware she was being recorded from the partially open doorway. "The problem with elderly women like Evelyn," she continued calmly, "is that they confuse sacrifice with ownership." One bridesmaid looked uncomfortable. "She is still his mother." Sophie shrugged. "And I am his future." Silence filled my kitchen around me while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. On screen, Sophie sat down near the makeup mirror while another bridesmaid adjusted the train of her robe. "Besides," Sophie added with a small smirk, "once Ryan gets full control after the wedding, we can finally simplify things." "Simplify," someone repeated. Sophie gave a quiet laugh. "Sell the Connecticut property. Move Evelyn somewhere smaller. Maybe assisted living eventually if she keeps causing drama." I stopped breathing for a second. Not because of the cruelty itself. Cruel people exist everywhere. But because she spoke about my future the way people discuss replacing outdated furniture. Practical. Efficient. Temporary inconvenience. One bridesmaid shifted awkwardly. "Does Ryan know you talk like this?" Sophie smiled into her champagne glass. "Ryan knows boundaries are healthy." Then the bedroom door opened behind her. My hands froze instantly above the keyboard. Ryan walked into the suite wearing black dress pants and a white shirt partly unbuttoned at the collar. He looked tired. Distracted. Older somehow than I remembered from only hours earlier. "There you are," Sophie smiled warmly. "We were just talking about tomorrow." Ryan nodded absent-mindedly before loosening his tie. "Did security get the updated guest restrictions?" The room went silent. Sophie glanced toward her bridesmaids briefly before answering. "Yes. Everything is handled." Ryan exhaled slowly and rubbed his forehead. "Good. I do not want any emotional scenes." I stared at the screen without moving at all. My son did not ask who was excluded. He already knew. Ryan walked closer then lowered his voice slightly. "Just make sure my mother does not find out before the ceremony." I watched the rest of the video without moving. Ryan loosened his tie and sat down beside Sophie while the bridesmaids quietly drifted toward the balcony, suddenly uncomfortable in the presence of something too personal to witness openly. Sophie touched Ryan's arm gently. "Everything is under control," she whispered. Ryan nodded once, staring down at the carpet for several seconds before speaking again. "She is going to be hurt." Sophie's expression hardened slightly. "Ryan, your mother has spent your entire life making you feel guilty for growing up." I felt my chest tighten at those words because they were not entirely unfamiliar. Sophie had been planting them quietly for years. Every time Ryan missed dinner with me. Every canceled holiday. Every awkward apology over the phone. The language always sounded strangely similar. Boundaries. Pressure. Emotional dependency. I used to think those were therapy phrases Sophie picked up from magazines or podcasts. Now I realized they were tools. Soft words sharp enough to separate a son from his mother one careful slice at a time. On the screen, Ryan rubbed his forehead again. He looked exhausted rather than cruel. Weak rather than malicious. Somehow that hurt even more. "I just do not want drama tomorrow," he repeated quietly. Sophie leaned closer and kissed his cheek gently. "Then trust me." The video ended there. No screaming. No sokkinken feschen. Just quiet betrayal wrapped in calm voices and luxury hotel lighting. That was the terrifying thing about family destruction. Most of the time it happens politely. I sat alone at the kitchen table while dawn slowly brightened the windows of my apartment. New York looked pale and exhausted beneath the early morning clouds. Beside me, Thomas's handwritten note still rested next to my cold teacup. Protect Evelyn when I no longer can. I finally understood what my husband meant. He was never afraid of loud cruelty. He feared subtle manipulation. The kind that arrives smiling. The kind that slowly convinces good people to betray the ones who love them most. Around 7 in the morning, Olivia woke quietly on the sofa and found me still sitting there in the same clothes from the wedding. "Grandma?" she asked softly. I looked up at her calmly. "I am all right." And strangely, for the first time since arriving at the hotel, I actually was. Not because the pain disappeared. It had not. A mother does not watch her son erase her from his life without carrying scars afterward. But clarity has its own kind of peace. The uncertainty was gone now. The excuses were gone. I no longer needed to wonder whether Sophie disliked me or whether Ryan was simply overwhelmed. I knew. Olivia sat beside me carefully. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. I looked toward the apartment windows where the city was beginning to wake up beneath gray morning light. Somewhere downtown, newly married guests were probably nursing champagne headaches while floral arrangements wilted quietly inside expensive ballrooms. Life moved forward quickly after humiliating someone. That is what people never tell you. The world does not pause to acknowledge your heartbreak. "Nothing dramatic," I answered softly. Olivia frowned slightly. "But Grandma..." I reached for the silver gift box still sitting unopened beside my purse. Ryan's watch rested inside exactly where I left it. Thomas's watch. The one meant to pass from father to son. I turned the box slowly in my hands before standing up from the table. "People like Sophie expect explosions," I said quietly. "They prepare for anger, tears, public scenes." I walked toward the hallway closet and retrieved my coat carefully. What they do not prepare for is silence. Olivia watched me nervously. "Where are you going?" I slipped the silver gift box into my purse before answering. "To Howard's office." Outside, the city air felt cold and clean after the rain. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. For a moment, I considered ignoring it completely. But when I looked down at the screen, I saw Ryan's name flashing there for the first time since the wedding began.